Hi. So I originally thought I was going to be up here in conversation with someone, so I don't have anything formally prepared. I know it's just kind of exciting. It's like I'm at a lectern with nothing in front of me, which is a little bit weird. But I thought I would just tell you a little bit about my journey getting sort of to basically to this lectern, and then hopefully you'll all ask some questions, and that'll work. And I've got, oh yes, there you go. Okay, well, we'll get to that. So I just, I'll start at the beginning. Well, not at the very beginning, although I will tell you, I was born in the Bronx. My kids were shocked when they found that out. Somehow I don't know where they thought I was born, but I was always a reader. I've always been a reader. I was the kid who sat in her bed with a flashlight or kept turning on my light, and turning it off when my mom would come in, just one more chapter. And thinking like I was getting away with it. No, of course my mom knew I was still reading, and what's she going to do, complain that her kid's reading? And, I was a walker for my elementary school because we lived close enough to the school, and I would have to walk through town and walk past the library. So I would always, have like big stack of library books, which was great because books were expensive. And, I was also the kid, whenever we visited my grandparents, they would give my sister and I each $10, which you could buy 5 Nancy Drews or 5 Bobbsey twins with that because they were $2 each. And so we would stop at Caldor's, which was sort of our local discount department store, on the way back, and my mom would cover the tax because we didn't have enough money for the tax. So that was what I did. I just read and read and read. And so I think it was just kind of natural that I would gravitate toward being a writer. People often say, well, what made you want to be a writer? And I said, well, I like to read. And so I'm convinced every writer not every reader becomes a writer, but every writer was and is a reader. I did have kind of a funny journey there. When I was in college, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I loved to read, and I think I'd always kind of written a little bit, but it never kind of occurred to me that might be a job. I don't know that I thought it couldn't be a job, but it just wasn't really on my radar. And when I finished up, I was, a senior college and, like everybody else trying to figure out what to do. And I didn't know how to apply for a job. I mean, who knows how to apply for a job? But I didn't know how to apply to school because I'd been doing that my whole life. And so somehow I got into my head that I was going to go to medical school. And I really love science, so it made sense. I'd kind of rediscovered my love of science that year, and I think I would be a good doctor if I had done that. And most of all, it provided me with a path. I needed this path to figure out what to do next. Okay, if you want to be a doctor, this is what you have to do, and that was great because now I knew how to do it. And so I, of course, had majored in art history, so I had not taken the required courses that you needed to do to be a doctor. And I said, well, that's not a problem. I'm actually really good at math and science. So I was, okay, great. So I informed this to my parents, and they said, okay. And I then spent the next 2 years taking these pre-medical courses that you have to do to apply to medical school. So I took chemistry over the summer, and then I took biology and physics, and then organic chemistry, and all these things. The only thing I had done was calculus that you have to do. And while I was taking these courses, I was not able to hold down a full-time job. You can't take 2 big science classes and have a real job. So I found some sort of, well, I'm a little ashamed to tell you now, I basically was at the dawn of telemarketing. This was before. It was really tele-fundraising. I saw an ad saying, you want to raise money for Planned Parenthood? And I said, yes, I want to raise money for Planned Parenthood. And so I was the person who called you. And then when the Planned Parenthood campaign was over, I raised money for Greenpeace and then for the Berkeley Repertory Theater. And, it was horrific now that I think about it. But at the time, it wasn't done nearly as much. So I think I wasn't disturbing people as much as they would have been disturbed if I did it 5 years later. And with that and taking my 2 classes, I still had a little time, and I thought, well, maybe I'll write, because I had started this romance novel after my junior year in college, and then I put it aside because I wasn't able to work on it while I was studying. I was just too busy, and so that's what I did. I worked on this romance novel, and because it was what I like to read for fun. And I was taking physics, as one does when they write their first romance novel. And I ended up getting accepted to medical school the same month I got my first book deal. So that was a really exciting month. I decided to postpone medical school because that's, once you're on that road, you're on it forever. And I did that. So I wrote, and my first book came out with, which with the cover I will frequently hold up to say, if any of you think that I did not start at the bottom, here's my first cover. My son, who is a freshman in college now, actually brought a copy of my first book with that cover, and he has it in his closet because it amuses him so much. So I did that. My husband, who's here, who did go to medical school, so he started at med school at Yale, and we moved to New Haven, and while he was in med school, I was working and writing, and then I had what I call my mid-20s crisis, which was when I thought, oh my gosh, if this writing thing doesn't work out, I'm not qualified to do anything. All my friends were going to graduate school, and this is just to show you how narrow my worldview was, because I'd already had 3 novels published, which is the dream, right? Everybody wants 3 novels published, but I was just like, I don't have a graduate degree, what am I gonna do? And so I went back to Yale and basically begged them to let me in, and they did. And so I started medical school 2 years behind when I thought I would. Did that for a few months and realized this is not the right thing. But the most amazing thing was when I withdrew, I went to the dean of students and I sort of explained my reasons for thinking that this wasn't right for me. He said, every year somebody comes around now saying they don't want to be here and they think they should withdraw, and you're actually the first time somebody has come to me and it makes sense. That I had, he's like, you've actually thought about it, all the reasons why, and it wasn't just that I thought, I have this other career to fall back on. It was, I said, there's certain aspects of it. I said, I don't think this is going to work for me. And then he said, I don't think we should charge you any tuition for your time here, which was so amazing. I could have been on the hook for a lot. And because I'd entered the class so late, they hadn't actually gotten around to billing me yet. And when I was deciding whether or not to withdraw, I had the Yale handbook there looking at it being like, oh my gosh, if I do it now, I'm only on the hook for 1/3, but if I wait, it could be 2/3. So if I'm going to withdraw, am I going to do it? I have to do it now. And I still have nightmares or, just bad dreams, I guess you'd say, where I don't know what happens and suddenly I'm like, oh yeah, I think I better go back to med school again. And then of course I get in there and like, ooh, I better withdraw again. And it's still the same lady, Lynn Wooten, he knows, and she's so disappointed in me. She's like, oh my gosh, we did this for you again, and you're leaving again. So that happens a lot. So anyway, I left med school, went back to full-time writing, and I've been doing it ever since. And when you work in genre fiction, it's a little different than some of the other types of fiction and how they build an author, and it's very much slow and steady wins the race for the most part. And the idea is that you bring out a book, and you publish it, and then you bring out another book, and hopefully you will slowly grow your audience over time. And with every book, you're going to gain new readers, and you're going to lose some because they're going to decide, no, she's not the right thing for me. And the idea is that hopefully you will gain more than you lose, and that's what I did, just the slow, steady pace. The Bridgerton series came out in 2000, where that's when the first book came out, and that was a little bit of a jump for me, but they didn't hit the New York Times list, or the first one didn't hit the New York Times list. It was the third one was my first book on the New York Times list proper. And again, the slow and steady build, and it never in a million years occurred to me that it was going to be on television, because people I don't know how many of you were in my earlier talk, but I basically said people don't adapt this type of book for television. If they want to do a period piece, they're going to do Jane Austen again, which is great. I'm here for all of the Jane Austen adaptations. I will absolutely watch them all, and I will love them all, to varying degrees. But they're not going to do my book, because if they do my book, it doesn't become a prestige piece like Jane Austen. And period pieces are also expensive. And they don't even do contemporary romance novels because that's considered very down market. And for some reason, adapting a romance novel isn't nearly as cool as writing your original rom-com, because probably because it was a man who wrote it instead of a woman. And so the point is that Hollywood did not look to romance novels for source material. And so, I was doing very well. Within the romance world, I was fairly well known, although the romance world is kind of this little bubble, and there's definitely a glass ceiling in which you don't break out. And it's kind of fun. You can be extraordinarily famous within your genre, and nobody else has ever heard of you. You might meet somebody and be like, oh, what do you do? I'm a writer. Oh, have you published anything? I said, yes. I've had 12 books on the New York Times list, but they haven't heard of you. And you know what? That's fine. I'm doing okay. So in 2017, in January, I was sitting at Starbucks, as one does when one lives in Seattle, pretending to write, as one does when one writes books. And the phone rang, and it was my agent, and he said, have you heard of Shondra Rhimes? And I said, yes. Yes, I have heard of Shondra Rhimes. Why? And he said, well, I've just had the most remarkable phone call. And he said, her representatives, because she has representatives who have representatives who have representatives who then call my representative. But I was going to say only one representative, but I guess now I have two. But and said, are the rights to the Bridgerton series still available? And if so, is Julia Quinn interested in selling them? And I said, and you didn't immediately answer yes? Like you actually thought you had to call me to ask about this? Like, surely you know me by now. And so he said, I'll call right back. I immediately texted my best friend, I tried to call her, she didn't answer, and I texted her, said, call me in all caps. She thought somebody died because I've never done that before. And I was like, oh my God. And that was before I found out I was supposed to keep it secret. And indeed, it was from the time of the first call to the time when they made a public announcement about this was 18 months. And so now you all know I can keep a secret. There are a few people know, only beaten by the fact that I was on a game show in 2001. I was on The Weakest Link, and I kept that a secret for a whole year because you have to sign a contract that says if you reveal the results of your show, you may be on the hook for $1 million to NBC. And I certainly didn't have $1 million, but I won, and I kept that a secret for the whole time, especially because they also don't pay you until it airs. So I was really afraid that, if I told somebody, then they'd be like, all right, we don't have to pay you now. And I was like, this is in my mortgage application that this money's coming. So I really need to make sure this money's going okay. So anyway, so we got a phone call, and I found out later that Shonda had not taken enough books with her on vacation or work travel or whatever, and she ran out, and somehow one of my books was there, and she read it, and then she went and read all my books. And that's what happened. It was, I had friends saying, how did this happen? Were you shopping this book out in Hollywood? And I said, no, it just came out of nowhere, and it never occurred to us to shop it. And it's not, that my agent wasn't doing his job. I mean, who would shop a romance novel to Hollywood? Because they'd laugh at you, right? We don't do that, except then somebody did. And I think it's, I don't think anybody should be surprised that the person who saw the potential in this was Shondra Rhimes, who, her big thing is, we are storytellers, and romances have stories. And I also think somebody was paying attention to the fact that some of these romance series have really big readerships. So we do have this built-in base who's going to come along with it. And the thing about romance, which was kind of nice, is even the romance readers, even the ones who don't like me, or aren't partially or even actively dislike me for some reason, still wanted to watch the show because they felt everybody was like, we must support this show or else we're never going to get another adaptation. So that was really nice. And so, the rest is kind of history. I kept my mouth shut for a year and a half, and we announced it, and then Bridgerton came out, in the middle of the pandemic, and I think it was really what everybody needed at the time. It was the show that celebrated human connection and celebrated a happy ending as something to aspire to, and to show happiness and joy as worthy goals. And when you think about that, that's not something you actually see in a lot of our literature or you don't see it celebrated in literature or television that often. It's, the goal is not necessarily happiness. The goal, we've got, I kind of joke, the great theme of, the white male quest. There's a lot of that, and then, when Hollywood wants to be diverse, they make it, the black female quest, and they just basically kind of take this archetypical white male story and just then put somebody who's not white or male or both in and give it to them instead. And so this was a very different type of story. And I found that a lot of the people in the media didn't really know how to talk about it. We sort of joke in our household that, whenever we see Bridgerton in the news, it's always like Netflix's raunchiest series. And I was like, it's not raunchy. I mean, there's sex scenes in it, but there's, have you seen Game of Thrones? And that's never used as the preferred adjective. I mean, people do talk about all the sex in Game of Thrones, but it's never described as, HBO's raunchiest series. I'm not sure what they describe it, but not that. And I think a big part of it is because Bridgerton was showing intimacy really from the female gaze. The truth is that you see a lot of naked male bottoms and not so much of the women. And it's also showing intimacy as something not transactional. And when you think about a lot of the times that we see intimacy on the screen, it is a very transactional thing. I was watching House of Cards, I think, around the time I was very late to the House of Cards bus, but I was watching that and I was thinking, this isn't like Netflix's raunchy show? It's like, oh my gosh, look at all this stuff. This is crazy. And they, but the sex there is very, very transactional. It's a very different type of thing. And I think because of that, the media just didn't really know how to describe it. And so they fell back on these other tropes. But that's kind of my journey to where I am now. And I'll tell you what's coming up. And then we'll start. Hopefully you guys will have questions because we still have 27 minutes. They have this great clock right here. So it's coming next. Actually, we've had Bridgerton season 1 and season 2, and there are 2 more seasons for sure that they're getting ready for, and we're all hoping for 8 because there were 8 books. So you all need to keep watching it. So they will do all 8. But Netflix ended up doing a prequel spinoff about Queen Charlotte, about when she first came to England, which was super fun for me. She's actually the only main character who wasn't in the books, and now she's the one getting her own show. But I love that character. She was hands down my favorite change from the books to the show was the addition of that character, in whole, because of Golda Rosheuvel, the actress who plays her, who's just incredible. And so they wrote this, it's a limited series with 6 episodes, Queen Charlotte, and Shondra Rhimes wrote the scripts herself, and then I took the scripts and I turned them into a book. So we now have books, which created a show, which created another show, which created a book, which is really fun. And that was a really fun and interesting experience for me. It was a very different type of writing. I'd never written with source material before, with something somebody else had written, and I had to take apart the architecture of it and rebuild it because a television show is 8,000 very short scenes, and I had to build them into chapters. And so that is coming out. And then we will have Bridgerton season 3. I don't know when yet. And I promise, well, if I did know, I couldn't tell you. But I'm telling you, I don't know, actually. They're still filming it, so they certainly don't have a date. But I've read the scripts. It's really good. I think you'll like it. So does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Okay, first of all, I want to tell you, your dress is adorable.
Oh, thank you.
I just love it. And I have been a reader of your books since you first started writing.
Oh, thank you.
I didn't wait for the TV show. I've been reading them all along. And I want to tell everybody how lucky you are to start with one and be able to read all of them and not have to wait for you.
Oh, thank you.
So I have a comment I do want to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I'm so happy that maybe they'll start making other romance series, because people do sort of sometimes make fun of me because I love to read romance because I want a happy ending. And in this society, you need some happy endings. But what I wonder is if you have noticed that they leave a lot of the humor out. And I found that in a whole bunch of things like the Sookie Stackhouse books.
Mm-hmm.
They take the humor out, and the humor is part of what makes your books so much fun. That's one. And
Okay.
number two, what did you think of them telling us who Lady Whistledown was in the first series?
Okay.
It was supposed to be a surprise at the end.
Okay. So, first of all, thank you for the compliment on the dress. I don't know who made it, but this was the first big change in my life. Is I now have a personal stylist. It's very exciting. Yes. Turns out if you go to Nordstrom, it doesn't cost any extra to have a stylist. I had no idea. I'll talk about Lady Whistledown first. So if you read the books, Lady Whistledown, her identity is not revealed until book 4. And I think originally they were planning to hold it out a little longer. And in fact, there was a red herring at the end. I'm allowed to finally talk about this now, that made the audience think it was Cressida. And that's what I read when they sent me the scripts. And then I think somebody thought, and this I agree with them, that anybody could just get on Google who it is, right? And so they were thinking there's no point in trying to keep it a secret. You know, they're dropping all 8 episodes at once, so it's good to keep it a secret for that. But once the show is out there, anybody could just look it up, and there's no way you would be able to avoid it. So they decided they would rather reveal it, own it, and then work it into the story. They didn't tell me that they had made that change. And so when I do see the episodes before you do, but so when I was watching it, you know, I was waiting for them, you know, this ending scene that I'd read with Cressida at the end, and instead there's Nicklin Coughlin who plays Penelope. I'm like, what? So that was great. You know, you'd think I couldn't possibly be surprised, but there it was. And so I do think that was the right thing to do. I think that it was just a secret that you couldn't have kept. And I do think that, you know, as I've through season 2 and then I've read season 3, I think having the audience in on it, they've been able to explore a few things differently that work very well for television as opposed to books. So there's that. Yeah, I think everybody was. But with most people, once you point out saying anybody could Google it and you could, then most people kind of get it. As far as the humor, I mean, I'd love to see a little bit more of it, but there are little bits and pieces in there too. I think a lot of sort of the broader humor might not actually translate as well to television. I think it might come across as slapstick, some of the broader humor that's in there. But I will say that in season 3, there are more actual lines lifted directly from the books and put in the show, which I'm really happy about. I mean, it's not by any sense a word for word anything, but there are some lines that end up in there, which is really nice. Right there.
Can you describe your writing process and give advice to any aspiring authors?
Can I describe my writing process and give advice to any aspiring authors? The first bit of advice is to take any writer's process with a grain of salt, because what works for me may not work for you and may not work for someone else. And I don't want you coming in, you know, working thinking I'm doing this wrong just because it's not how she does it. For me personally, I tend to write a fairly detailed outline's not really the right word, maybe synopsis, summary. But what is a little different about it, at least for me, is that the beginning of it is all about the characters. Instead of opening with how we're opening in a book, I open with who the characters are. And I talk a lot about, you know, everything that's happened to them to get them to this point, because I think that, you know, it's nature and nurture. You know, it's one thing to say, oh, she's stubborn and headstrong or whatever, but you can be stubborn and two stubborn, headstrong people are going to be very, very different based on their experiences up to page 1. And so I will know a lot about the characters, and I maybe even will describe some of their experiences in the outline that never actually make it to the book, but I know them better because of that process, and hopefully that helps me to make a richer character. And then from that point on, I'll start talking about, okay, well, this happens, and that happens, and this happens, and I'll also probably end up at some point saying things happen in the outline, because I know this happens, and I know that happens, and I have no idea how I'm going to get from here to there, but I'm hoping that by the time I get here writing it, it'll be obvious. And so parts of the outline will be that vague, and parts will have actual pieces of dialogue in it, because, as I'm writing the outline, a really good piece of dialogue comes to me, and if I don't write it down right, I'm not going to remember it when I get to it 3 months later. So it's funny. It's, this kind of mashup of the most granular, detailed outline and total broad, they're going to kiss and they're going to live happily ever after, that sort of thing. And then I probably stick to that outline maybe 75 to 80%, because things come up. And you'll be writing and all of a sudden you think, well, actually, such and such doesn't make sense, and this would happen instead, and so it'll change a little bit. And then when I do start writing, I mostly write chronologically across, from page 1 on, and I edit as I go along pretty intensely, so I'm constantly like this. So I don't really have a first draft, because there's so much editing as I'm moving along that by the time I get to the end, it's pretty much done. It does mean, though, that the beginning has been gone over more than the end, because I'm constantly like this. So generally, in my books, all the typos are towards the end, because I haven't looked at it as much. So I've been warning my editor to pay close attention to the end for the typos. But that's generally my process, right there.
Okay. So for the experience in the romance, do you kind of take your character's experiences and kind of make them your own? So your experience, you put it onto your characters. Do you do that?
So the question is, do I use my own experiences in my characters? Not really experiences, but moments and memories. So, for example, the character of Penelope Featherington, I would say more than any other character, I drew from some of my own adolescent experiences and feelings, and that sense of knowing who you are, really, but not knowing how to be that person on the outside, which I think a lot of us have experienced. And so it's not like necessarily actual events so much as feelings. Or, I had another character who has what we would now recognize as a very mild case of OCD. And I thought, okay, so I gave her all, little quirks that people have. So for me, I thought everybody did this until recently, but like if I'm walking upstairs and nobody else is with me, I always count the stairs. Oh, you're nodding. Okay, apparently not everybody does that. I thought everybody did that, that everybody counted stairs when they were going up and down stairs. They don't. Someone says, oh, well, it's like, everybody has certain things in their personality that, if you magnified it, would be part of, possibly obsessive compulsive disorder. I said, okay, so I gave her that. I gave her, something from my best friend. I gave her my husband. I found out we'd been married over 20 years when I found out that when he puts his shoes away, he has to put the left on the left and the right on the right. Like when you put them in the closet or whatever. You do? Okay, I never did that. He's like, yeah, it drives me nuts. And I'm thinking, you never said anything, I still don't really do it, but, so I gave her that too. So, little things like that, I kind of collected from other people. Well, I guess right next to you. Okay, she was pointing to you.
In the book, the Duke is not really he has a friendship with the Duchess, but in the movie, we see Simon's father not really care for the Duchess as much, and kind of doesn't care about, in the book, it says they have a friendship and that that he mourned her. We never get to see that in the show. Is that normal?
So I don't have anything to do with the adaptation, and so when a novel is adapted for television, they really have to kind of take bits and pieces, to see what they think will work best. I mean, for me, in terms of, when you say the Duchess, you mean Simon's mother? Yeah, I mean, bear in mind, I don't reread my books that often, so you're probably way more familiar with the text than I am. But, I mean, I think he mourned her mostly because he was glad that she finally gave him what he wanted, which was a son. And so, I mean, that proved her worth to him, so he was thankful for her. But I don't think he loved her or anything like that. Yes?
Now that you've sort of busted the romance novels don't get adapted fence, is there a romance series you didn't write that you would have wanted to see on screen?
Oh, is there one that I didn't write that I would want to see on screen?
One that you encountered as a reader.
Then I encountered as a reader. For historical romance, there's a great series by an author named Julianne Long, who is very underappreciated, called the Pennyroyal Green series, which so good and so well written. And I'll read her stuff and think, God, I'm a hack. I can't believe I'm doing well. Thank you. We can both be good. I think hers would be great. There are a number of things in, not necessarily production, but that are kind of going through the stages up to production right now, which is very exciting. It's a book by Vanessa Riley called Island Queen, which is historical fiction, but she also writes historical romance, so she has, I think, a lot of romantic themes in there. And that one was optioned by Julianne Robinson, who's the director of the Bridgerton pilot, and by Adjoa Andoh, who plays Lady Danbury. They did that one together, so I'm very excited about that. I don't know where in the process they are, whether they've reached the point of no return where we know it'll actually get made. Penny Reed's series, I don't know if you know Penny Reed, the Winston Brothers series. That one recently got optioned, and that was fun. She lives in Seattle, so I have lunch with her every now and then. And she said what happened was somebody went out and basically some film agent said to her underlings, go find me 5 romance novels that you think would make a good series. I want Bridgerton, but contemporary. And so they were looking for, something with kind of a close-knit family and that sort of thing. And they all came in, and that was the one the person liked.
Because people get sent on those little quests. I was a romance bookseller for a really long time, and after Bridgerton came out, a lady from Hallmark came out and was like, find me XYZ.
So will you tell me, what do you think would make a good series?
No idea.
Oh, okay.
Write the stuff.
Yeah, but you're a reader. You could tell me what you think would be good.
Tessa Dare's stuff.
Hers would also be very good, too. Tessa Dare.
I want Georgette Heyer.
Oh. So do you guys familiar with Georgette Heyer? So,
If you haven't, you have to read.
well, she's considered kind of problematic now. It turns out she was actually not a very nice person.
She wasn't, and she was anti-Semitic, but her books are still good.
Okay. And she, one thing that's kind of fun about Georgette Heyer is for a long time people really held her up as like a really good resource. And it turns out she just made stuff up. There are words that we now use that we realize we think she just made up, like the word delope, which means when you go to a duel, when you fire in the air instead of firing at the person, they call it deloping. And we now think she made that up. Yeah, I've heard. I've tried to look it up, and I found that maybe it comes from the French, but I think it might be Georgette Heyer who did it. I did once get my college alumni magazine ran a piece on me, which was kind of fun, and I ended up getting an email because of that from her former editor, her American editor. So he didn't actually edit the books because I think they were all edited in the UK, and he was just one to shepherd them through the publishing process. But that was actually pretty exciting. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I think adapting Georgette Heyer would be a lot like adapting Poldark or something. They're written in that same, they're written in the same time period. They're not quite classics, but they're old enough and the person's kind of revered enough that it might get at some of that, masterpiece gloss to it, so maybe it could get made.
And they could leave out the anti-Semitic part.
Well, one would hope, yeah.
Oh, I do have one more question.
Sure.
Now, I really appreciate it, but what did you think about them making your characters so diverse?
Yeah, so I was delighted that they did that. About making the actors are much more diverse. In the books, the characters are all white, I don't actually say they're white, but it's implied, I guess. It never really occurred to me to. Oh. Busted. Sorry. I was fairly certain that Shondaland would make the series more diverse. That's part of what they do. I wasn't sure how they would do it. There are a lot of different ways you could. I thought perhaps they might tinker with the storyline to bring in aspects of, what happens when you have this all-white society and somebody of color comes in, whatever, I don't know. And instead they decided, or they could do completely colorblind, which is not, they call it color conscious, not colorblind, which could have been like, the Bridgertons might have been all different races. And I've seen things like that. I've seen Shakespeare done that way. And instead they came in somewhere in between, which was color conscious. And they started with this idea that what if Queen Charlotte was of mixed race? And there are some people believe that she was. I don't think it's something we'll ever know for sure. And if that were true, what would have happened if that had just been accepted that way and she used her position to change society? And so they came up with this alternate universe, really. And I think it's wonderful because the point of a romance really is happy endings. And I think everybody deserves a happy ending. And I love the idea of people being able to see themselves in the story. And the other thing that's really great is television is such a collaborative medium. There's so many people involved in the creation of it that they can bring their experiences and ideas to the table in ways that I perhaps can't. And I don't think I could have created such a wonderful, diverse world as well as this collection of people did. And so I'm very grateful. Yeah. Yes?
What's your inspiration for the book?
What was my inspiration for the book? Honestly, I don't remember. It was so long ago.
Your art history background?
Not that much, except that actually I did art history, but it was really the focus on history of architecture. I just thought it was really interesting how the built environment, how you could study history through the built environment. Not so much. By the time I wrote The Duke and I, which is the first book in the Bridgerton series, I'd been writing for some time. So that wasn't my first book, and so I was already writing in the Regency time period. That was my thing. So, part of the question might be like, okay, what inspired you to write in that time period? Is what I like to read. I just thought it was fun. I liked the witty dialogue. I do get asked that question a lot, and I always have this very unfulfilling answer, which is I don't really remember. What I do remember, though, is the first character for the Bridgerton series, the first character to start to develop in my mind was Simon. And the reason for that was one of my husband's classmates had a very severe stutter. And it's funny, you say you don't remember this guy at all. He was older than you. I can't remember his name. He was older than you and from New York City, and that's all I remember. But he had a very severe stutter, and he'd obviously overcome it, to the point where he was in medical school at Yale and doing very well. And I believe he'd had a lot of support. And I just started thinking, like, well, what would have been like to have that severe of a stutter back then at a time when, people didn't necessarily know how to help you through it or how to love you in spite of it or with it, that sort of thing. And, because in romance we have just a world of bad parents, I thought, okay, give him really bad parents, what happens if you have, and then so that's how he was kind of created. And then when I was trying to figure out, well, who will he fall in love with? I wanted to give him somebody who had just the absolute opposite experience of family life. And that's how the Bridgertons came into being, because I wanted to give him, marry into this really wonderful, warm family. And beyond that, I don't really recall what. Yes.
I love that you just wrapped up the fact that you really respected the adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering earlier before you said that, if you ever did something and brought it to the screen, would you want to be more involved in the scenes that you've been with this one?
The question is, if I ever did something else and brought it to the screen, would I want to be more involved? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. It really.
Are there times that you get like a little twinge that you wish you could have been a fly on the wall or part of that conversation? Or has it been free to just let them do it?
I think it's been freeing to let them do it, just because they're good. I mean, it would be a different story if I didn't have such good people working on it, but I'm not going to tell Shondra Rhimes how to make television. She knows what she's doing. She's a good track record. And, the results kind of speak for themselves. And so would I like to be more involved? Maybe I'd like to get out and visit the set more often, but, that's also on me. It's just so far away. I have stuff going on at home. It's hard for me to do all that. I did actually, so I think I said, we've got this prequel series coming out, and I thought that might be kind of fun to be more involved in because it's not actually based on my books, and maybe I could get involved in the writing of that. But then it turned out there was no writer's room for that. Shondra just wrote them all herself, and so that got rid of my opportunity there. But we'll see. I don't know. Yes.
I just thought of a book that, and I was going to look up the author because I can't remember it. I thought, how did they make this? This is the book they picked to make Mr. Malcolm's List. Did anybody see Mr. Malcolm's List? Okay. An unknown writer.
Yeah, that's true. That one got adapted. I don't know the story behind that.
And it was very diverse cast.
Mhm.
Nobody in the families were even, there was a Chinese girl and when I saw that was being made, and I read that book, and I didn't think it was very good. And I went, this is the book they picked, and wasn't very popular because nobody's ever heard of her. So
Yeah.
yours are at least people, you had a fan base.
There was. And in fact, one thing that was very funny is, I told Netflix before, or I said I told my representative who told their representative, it's amazing the levels that you go through to get to people. I said, I have a pretty devoted fan base in Brazil. And they're pretty loud online. Oh, yeah, we got it. And then they announced the show, and the very next day, somebody's like, we need to get Portuguese interpreters. We don't need, because they were really taken by surprise by the fervor of the Brazilian Portuguese fans. Yeah, so that was really fun. If they ever sent, and then they couldn't send the actors on an international tour because of COVID, but oh my goodness, if they sent them to Brazil, it would be insane. I've gone on 2 book tours in Brazil, and it's not like doing a book tour here. They treat authors like rock stars. I have to have security. People are screaming. Oh, and my kids are like, they're like, that's so funny. I can't believe people are like that for you. Like, yeah. It's like, I was like, yeah, welcome to your college tuition. And they shut up after that. Yeah, my nephew the other day said something like, oh, I guess people read that sappy stuff. I'm like, hey, that sappy stuff is going to pay for your college tuition, so you can be quiet. Sorry, I'm saying too much, but I don't even remember what we were talking about. Oh, Mr. Malcolm's List.
And it's out of nowhere.
Oh.
And it was
It was a self-pub hit is what happened.
Really?
Yes. Before it got picked up by a primary publisher, it was a self-pub hit. I only know this because I was a bookseller.
Right, and I read it and I thought, this isn't a very good book, and then I think they're making a movie out of this terrible book. But the movie actually wasn't bad.
I haven't seen the movie, but it looked like it had very good production values.
It had and it was during COVID, so there's almost no extras.
Mhm.
It's just the cast. And they got Hugh Laurie in it, and they got...
Hugh Laurie was in it?
I think, was it?
It was a book called Mr. Malcolm's List. Suzanne Elaine, I think her name was, the author.
The main character was a black guy, and then one of the love interests was Chinese. It was completely, and the costumes were beautiful. But the interesting thing is they reused them. They didn't make everybody wear new things every single time. I was very impressed by that.
Mm-hmm.
And,
They did that. I noticed that in BBC's most recent Emma adaptation with Romola, I forget her last name, that she wore the same dress many times, which I thought was very...
I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, they did not do that in Bridgerton. Phoebe Dinevor, who played Daphne, had 105 costumes.
Oh, Hugh Laurie was in the adaptation.
Yeah, it was amazing. I got to visit the big, and we only have a minute, let me tell you. But I'll just tell you, before I got to go to the soundstage, I went to the place where the costume warehouse, and that was unbelievable. They had like these bolts of fabric. I was like, oh, and it was labeled double velvet. And I was like, oh, does that mean it's like doubly soft? They're like, no, we just have 2 rolls of it. I was like, I thought it was like double cream or something. I was like, oh, it's so nice. And then there, by the time I got there, by the time I got there, they were almost done. And so the only people left there was the Daphne team. And it was really cute. They were like, we're Team Daphne. And we did 105 dresses. And there's this big poster with swatches from all her dresses. And yeah, it was really incredible. And now I have exactly 1 minute left. So I probably should wrap up and say thank you all for asking such great questions.